to thank everyone for coming and joining us for this event on the modern independent workforce. And when we decided to do this, it became quickly apparent that I knew nothing about the topic, and as an institution we knew relatively little. And so we started reaching out to folks to give us some advice on the best way to configure this. And I want to thank the Direct Selling Association and Joe Molinaro in particular for all the help that we got in finding and work on the research that led into this. I think it's a very important topic. It has turned out to be an exceedingly timely event, and we are blessed by an excellent panel, a fine moderator, and my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker. FTC Commissioner Maureen Olshausen is a fine public servant. I think everyone in this room should respect the efforts that people put into their public service, and she has a long and stellar record of helping out, whether in the U.S. Court of Appeals or having previously run the Office of Policy Planning at the FTC, and as a personal note, working for my favorite FTC commissioner ever, Orson Swindle. She has now, since 2012, been a commissioner of the FTC, and we thank her for her efforts at the FTC, applaud her public service, and are grateful that she's willing to be here today to share her thoughts. Please.
Well, Doug, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm delighted to be here. I just returned from a trip to Greece, and so with your indulgence, I'd like to kick off the discussion of this very new topic with a very old story. In 490 BC, the greatly outnumbered Greek army turned back a huge Persian invasion, and this was very big news at the time. According to a legendary story, the news of the Greek victory was entrusted to Phidippides, a professional message runner who had recently completed several other amazing runs in service to the war effort. Phidippides ran from the battlefield to Athens, a distance of about 25 miles. And poor Phidippides died from the extraordinary exertion of his final run. But the news he dramatically delivered with his dying breath was that the Athenians had just won the Battle of Marathon. Now today, things wouldn't be quite so romantic. A bystander in Marathon would have tweeted the news in 140 snarky characters. The world we live in is almost incomprehensibly different than the world Phidippides experienced. Of course, people still laugh and cry and fall in love in much the same way they always have. Many of the biggest differences between the world of 2015 AD and 490 BC are the result of over 2 millennia of intervening technological innovation. Useful inventions become technology. Technology can eventually reorder markets and even whole societies over time. This process has been happening for a very long time, and it is likely to continue long after we are all gone. The changes wrought by innovation are often disruptive. When markets reach an inflection point, the beneficiaries of the status quo regularly predict that the latest change will lead to ruin. The original Luddites smashed textile machines in England. Today, their modern incarnations often run off to the government in an effort to staunch the flow of progress through stifling regulation. Over the long term, these efforts to defend the older order almost always fail. When something can be improved, it inevitably will be. While progress normally wins out eventually, the defenders of the status quo can certainly muck things up in the works in the near term. So when I look at some of the dynamic changes being created in the organization of work, changes facilitated by new technology, I tend to take a very long view. I know there will be winners and losers created by these developments because past innovations often triggered disruptions, and there is no good reason to think that this time will be any different. I know that the claims of ruin put forward by those with an economic interest in the status quo are likely to be overblown for the very same reason. I also recognize that many other seemingly important innovations have ultimately fallen short of their lofty expectations. Not every apparent advancement will turn out to be as momentous as the light bulb, even if it might seem very important to all of us at the moment. Finally, I understand that innovations rarely provide us with nothing but simple, unalloyed good. The cell phone may have rendered Phidippides' job laughably obsolete, but it also gave us texting drivers. For that matter, cars and planes gave us extraordinary freedom of movement, but they also gave us traffic jams and the middle seat in coach. Yet, it is important to remember that while we may all hate the middle seat in coach, few of us would prefer to take a covered wagon on our next business trip across the country. Even when one can identify a downside associated with a particular innovation, this does not necessarily render the whole innovation suspect or socially undesirable. That said, sometimes the problems created by innovation can be much more significant. Those of us who favor economic progress need not flinch from that issue. Indeed, progress fundamentally requires the possibility of failure and mistakes. A perfectly risk-free world would be completely static. It recognizes and adapts to failures and mistakes. Sometimes this means that when real, concrete harm swings into view, a regulatory response may be necessary. For example, cars brought us drunk driving and a new need for laws against it. However, note that drunk driving laws are narrowly tailored to a known, identified harm. They do not ban driving generally or create a complex regulatory framework that effectively makes car ownership or usage economically impossible for most people. This same example helps illustrate another important point. It is very difficult to accurately predict and prevent harms ahead of time. I'm fairly confident that if our old friend Phidippides suddenly encountered a modern car, he probably wouldn't have immediately realized that one of the most appropriate regulatory responses to this innovation would be to pass a drunk driving law. Now, as I've said many times before, regulators need to recognize the limits of their knowledge. We are no better predictors of the future than anyone else, and we can be spectacularly wrong about the ways markets are going to develop over time. We should all remember the AOL-Time Warner merger and everyone's great concern about market power and dial-up internet access whenever we're feeling confident about our ability to predict the future. So adopting a posture of regulatory humility is a general principle of good government. This general principle is applicable when regulators encounter dynamic, rapidly changing markets that have the potential to introduce transformative benefits into society. The new ways of organizing work using modern technology represent exactly this sort of nascent, dynamic trend in the economy. Of course, there have always been ways to make a living that do not require a job in a larger organization. Lawyers and doctors have long had the option of working independently. Ubiquitous high-speed internet access, cloud-based services, and spectacularly powerful cell phones are now spreading that same privilege out into additional segments of society. It's easy to imagine how some people may benefit from working independently. People caring for small children or aging relatives can now find work that matches their sometimes sporadic and unpredictable availability. Others can take on work in addition to their regular full-time jobs to help cover unexpected expenses or just provide additional. People can vary the amount of work they do to better balance their need for income with other demands on their time. The so-called sharing economy can also unlock additional value in assets like automobiles or spare bedrooms that are underutilized today. Companies with uneven demands for their goods and services may be able to more flexibly increase or reduce their staffing needs and pass along the savings to consumers through lower prices. These technology platforms may also lower barriers into the workforce for people who are struggling to obtain a more traditional job. Although we are still in early days, research into the actual impact of these new work models seems the contention that these services can provide meaningful social benefits. For example, Alan Kruger has done some interesting work looking at Uber drivers. His work suggests things that Uber drivers may be making more money per hour than traditional cab drivers and chauffeurs, and that large number of Uber drivers are particularly drawn to the flexible nature of the work. He also found that most Uber drivers already had a full-time job at the time they started driving with Uber. And I look forward to hearing more from Alan on his findings. Other research suggests that people who work independently have high levels of satisfaction with their work situation. MBO Partners, a firm that assists independent workers, recently conducted a survey of independent workers and found that over 80% are either satisfied or highly satisfied with their work situation. This suggests, perhaps not surprisingly, that the people most attracted to this kind of work are the ones most likely to pursue it. For a regulator, the potential benefits of these changes are a key signal to proceed carefully. If people are broadly benefiting from changes in the economy, we should be particularly cautious about taking actions that may abridge or eliminate them. As regulators, it is not our job to pick winners or losers in the economy. In the absence of identified concrete harm, we do not need to be closely regulating private economic activity. So let me suggest that the better course here is caution. We can simply wait and see what develops in this area. If real harms actually do arise, that is the appropriate time for action. At that point, we will know a lot more than we know now, and we can narrowly tailor whatever regulation may be required to address that clear, identifiable harm. For now, we should let markets do one of the things they truly excel at doing, which is sorting out innovations that are ultimately useful and beneficial to society. So with that, I'll conclude. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm happy to take any questions.
The commissioner has agreed to answer questions. Yes, sorry. If you have a question, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone, identify yourself, ask your question in the form of a question with a question mark at the end. Thank you. And I am going to take the chair's prerogative.
Yes.
As many people probably know, the White House and the Treasury put out earlier this week a report on occupational licensing and the potential for it as both a good standard for professional excellence, but also as a barrier to entry for people. And the question arises, what can someone at the federal level do when so much of this is being done at the state level, and how important is that in the evolution of this area?
Well, professional licensing raises a very important antitrust issue, which has to do with what actions can private actors take at the state level to restrict competition or raise barriers to entry in their profession without them running afoul of the federal antitrust laws. And this is an issue that the FTC has long paid attention to. Where do we draw the line in the right place? And I personally have played a big role in that. And we recently won a case in the U.S. Supreme Court against a board of dentists in North Carolina who had decided that they were going to define tooth whitening as the practice of dentistry as a way to shut down competition from non-dentist tooth whiteners. And what we argued, and successfully in the Supreme Court, is that for a board of interested industry members, right, who have a financial interest in this, for them to go making rules about who can practice and what's the actual practice of their profession, that they have to have a clearly articulated power to do that from the state, and then the state has to actively supervise them. Because while professional licensing can often play a very useful role, we think of licensing of dentists, of doctors, of other professionals, that role really has to be directed towards the public good, towards making sure that the services people are getting are of good quality, that there's not deception happening. But they can't be directed to merely fencing off new forms of competition to benefit the professionals in that profession and say new can't come in. And this is something we've seen played out over and over and over again as new technologies come online. So I'm very glad that the FTC has won this victory at the Supreme Court level because it creates a unique opportunity for us to work with the states, because a number of the states have come to us since and say, well, how do we make sure our boards are not violating the antitrust laws? How do we make sure that we're overseeing them correctly to make sure what they're doing is really in the public interest? And so the FTC has promised to give guidance to the states and to engage with them to create a better, to help them make sure that their oversight system is really serving the public interest goals that it should. So as state licensing has proliferated, I think now maybe 30% of occupations require some kind of state license. It's very important that we ensure that the licensing serves the public rather than private financial interests.
Quick question. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question. I'm with the Direct Selling Association. So some of the things you were saying really resonated. People being satisfied, innovation. That sounded exactly like to me. The 18 million people or so who are involved in direct selling have been doing it for a long time. It's also encouraged what you're basically saying. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but sort of let's be cautious about regulation. Let's be cautious about government interference, unless you know there's specific issues, which I know you do at the FTC when you look at cases and consumers and so forth and you investigate them. But one of the things picking up on Doug, and I want your assessment of this is, sometimes it's not called regulation, but government requirements, sometimes from the FTC and other agencies, DOL, on disclosures and so forth, that really create impediments and almost employer-employee type of review, information, and so forth, that ultimately, want to know your view, was that is consistent with your idea that this might actually be an impediment to what's already working? In other words, one thing is when there's a specific case, which you should look at on issues, but not sort of where you take a broad approach through disclosures or other requirements that in effect are tantamount to regulation.
So at the FTC, and I should say I am just speaking for myself and not the whole FTC or my fellow commissioners, we enforce our basic statute, which prohibits unfair and deceptive acts or practices, unfair methods of competition authority, but unfair and deceptive acts or practices. And we do generally proceed on a case-by-case basis, charged with looking at things from the consumer's point of view. So we're often looking at whether certain representations are deceptive or misleading to consumers. Now, in some ways, we have created obligations that companies make sure that consumers understand what they're getting into, and if the representation is made and it's misleading, that there be some sort of disclosure that clarifies that for consumers. We often get the request, as you mentioned, we proceed on a case-by-case basis, but we often get the request for broader guidance. I hear this a lot. Okay, case-by-case has its pluses, but also has its minuses. And one of the things that I often focus on is how are we successful as an agency? How do we measure success? I like to measure it by making consumers better off, not necessarily by bringing a lot of cases. Cases are necessary, but if we can give guidance to business that allows them to fashion their marketing materials, their advertising, how they deal with consumers in a way that they know that they'll be complying with the law, that's also a very effective way, I think, for us to use our limited resources. I think we're really all better off if business knows what our obligations are, what the legal obligations are. Consumers aren't harmed, businesses aren't in trouble, and our limited resources are preservably harmful and fraudulent actors.
I'd like to I'm sorry to do this, a quick follow-up, because I completely agree with that, but maybe I was inarticulate in my focus of my question. I completely agree about consumers. I was focused on, since this is a discussion about the workplace and about innovation and opportunities, you mentioned Uber, you mentioned other things, it's about the disclosure requirements regarding independent contractors and those entering into the business, not the consumers.
So the FTC doesn't cover labor relations. We do have a franchise rule, right? So there is a requirement that if you are offering a franchise, that you give certain disclosures to people about the risks and benefits of that. So between an employer and an employee, or between even if it's not an employer-employee relationship, that's not typically something the FTC. It's more. We're focused on representations, advertisements to the general public, to consumers.
So stay in your seat, and when we get Secretary Perez here, ask again. Well, then join me in thanking the Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So we are going to have a brief set change. We take rid of the podium, put up the panel, and then Eric Morath of the Wall Street Journal, who has generously agreed to moderate, will introduce the panel and start the discussion.
Oh, no, let me take that. That's all right. No, please. He did thank her.
All right, thank you for coming up here and joining us. I'd like to introduce our panel. Lori Bush, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of Roden and Fields, a selling company of skincare products. We have Alan Kruger. He's a professor of economics and public affairs at Princeton University and the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. We have Carl Pierre, the head of DC operations at WeWork, a startup that creates collaborative workspaces on a global level. So I'd like to hear from each of you on this topic, maybe some introductory remarks, and then I'll have a few questions and love to have the audience ask you some questions as well. Would you like to start, Lori?
Oh, I'd love to start. So Rodan and Fields is a premium skincare company that deploys a direct selling, or what we now like to think of as social commerce model. But back in around 2005, the term crowdsourcing started entering our vernacular as being the combination of outsourcing to the crowd, oftentimes leveraging online communities, as opposed to using employees for different services, ideas. In many ways, I think of direct selling as crowdsourcing aspects of sales, marketing, sometimes sales force development. And that's really how we've approached direct selling from a Rodan and Fields perspective. Our primary industry is beauty, it's skincare, and direct selling is our go-to-market strategy. We didn't start there originally, and so for some reason, in some ways we're unusual in that. But the reasons that we went into direct selling make a lot of sense for a lot of companies. There are some real marketplace and economic advantages from a company perspective to deploying a direct selling model. For one thing, it lowers the barriers to entry, especially for consumer products, consumer services. Getting distribution in traditional consumer packaged goods channels, such as food, drug, and mass and department stores, can be very onerous, costly, and risky for a small company, for a startup. Secondly, direct selling really provides an opportunity, a good outlet for innovation, because it creates a closer connection to the end consumer of the product. You can create robust experiences around the product, around the brand. And today, in this time when mass media is becoming less effective as a way to really put a marketing message out there, with fragmentation of different media outlets, being able to leverage a distributed sales organization and their networks to communicate is far more effective and cost-effective when you can no longer really have a lot of viewers around a single media source. Now, in the process of creating this business platform that enables a distributed sales organization to be effective, it creates a lot of opportunities and benefits for the direct sellers themselves. It's our responsibility to create an effective distributed business platform, and in our case, a distributed e-commerce platform that allows them to take advantage of an opportunity to participate in the marketplace value that we're creating through our brand and through our product activities. It's a low barrier to entry for the direct seller. It's a meritocracy, effectively. There's no specific background that's required. There should be, in most direct selling programs, very low to no cost of entry associated with entering the business model. And it allows people to potentially work at their own time, their own pace from a home office, or in a location wherever they are during their choice. They could work part-time, they could look to build a full-time income out of it. A lot of it is based on their desires, their goals, and the reasons that they participate. Rodan and Fields actually, as I mentioned, did not start off in direct selling. We started off in department stores. And what we found there is it wasn't a very hospitable channel for us. The department stores were not really doing anything to help us break through the clutter in the space, if you will. We were competing with a lot of other brands, a lot of other companies for attention. And what we found was that most of the people coming in for the products were coming in as a result of word of mouth. It became obvious to us that really leveraging a more word of mouth business model made a lot of sense. But one of the things we started off with at the very heart of our direct selling pivot, which was in 2008, was to take a digital approach, really recognizing how digital technology is transforming everything. It transforms the way people learn about products, it transforms the way they engage in products, and it really transforms the way transactions can be not only conducted but also monitored and managed. And so we started off with a distributed e-commerce platform. All of our independent consultants, which is what we call our representatives, get a replicated website that's a portal to our e-commerce platform. And they effectively have a royalty-free license to our intellectual property, our marketing assets, which we control very tightly. And through this business model, they're able to create a presence for our brand and create a lot of experiences around the brand. And in the process, they're able to participate in taking market share in a very large, growing, robust, and important product category from our perspective, treating the signs of aging and helping their friends and family and others participate from a product perspective and in some cases from a business perspective. There are a lot of advantages to the e-commerce aspect of direct selling. Number one, it precludes any need for our consultants to carry inventory at all. So there's effectively no inventory carrying costs, no startup costs, and it gives us complete transparency because we do the fulfillment from our distribution center to the end users. So we know where all the product is in the system. It also gives us a tremendous amount of data. We have millions of customer records that we can then overlay in terms of other databases and get a lot of texture about who the customers are and how they use the products, and then share that information with the sales organization so they could be more effective at building their business, targeting the appropriate customers, and helping others build their businesses as they bring them in.
Lori, and I want to talk to you a little bit more about the technology as we kind of discussed this with all the panelists. Alan could maybe take a moment here to give us just a view of how large this is part of our economy.
Thanks. Slides, which is an occupational hazard, and hopefully you've got copies of them there or can see them here. I want to make a few points. The first is labor force statistics do a poor job capturing the 1099 economy or growth in self-employment. And this chart really makes the point. The red line is based on IRS data on number of people who file Schedule C for self-employment income each year. The blue and the green lines are based on the current population survey. According to the household survey, which is used to calculate the unemployment rate each month, self-employment has been declining. Based on the IRS data, it's been rising. If you look at filings of 1099 for miscellaneous income, this is something I wanted to look at because most of the should show up as 1099 miscellaneous income. And there's a gradual rise. Treasury produced this for me. It's the number of income tax filers who reported 1099 miscellaneous income divided by total employment based on the household survey. And it's up about 1.5 points over the last 15 years. So and it's actually from a relatively low base, from 11% to almost 13%. So it's not kind of a stampede in this area, but there's been a gradual upward trend. Now, one of the reasons why I've been interested in this area is because, as Commissioner Olhausen mentioned, I've been doing work on Uber together with Jonathan Hall, who's head of research for Uber. And this chart shows you the number of Uber driver partners, that's their term, rising from basically 0 in the middle of 2012 to over 160,000 at the end of last year. The rate of growth has been more than doubling every 6 months. So if it kept up that pace into this year, there are now over 300,000 Uber drivers. And that's truly remarkable growth. On the other hand, I don't know how many other examples there are like this kind of growth. I'll come back to that. We asked the drivers, do they have other work? And quite interesting to me, about 31% have another job, 30% have another part-time job, and about 38% are working only for Uber or working with Uber because they're not employees of Uber and not doing additional work. And there's a tremendous amount of sorting. Even within Uber, there's a lot of sorting. There are some people who are doing it full-time. There are some people who are doing it on a very occasional basis. And one of the reasons why I think so much sorting takes place, there's tremendous flexibility. The Uber drivers could choose how many hours they work or whether they work from week to week. Every driver who worked in one particular week looks at what they did the next week. Did their hours go up? Did they go down? How much did they change by? And the numbers are really impressive. 43% worked either 50% more or 50% less than they had the previous week. So the drivers are varying their schedules considerably from week to week. Now, I expected, because of the growth of Uber, you'd see more people with multiple jobs. The current population survey, which asks people whether they have more than one job, actually shows a gradual downward decline in multiple jobs, which is quite surprising to me, given my presumption of the growth of this segment of the economy. So Larry Katz and I have started a project where we want to probe and see, are the statistics that we rely on missing occasional work? Because for the Uber drivers, for example, many of them are working very short time hours, varies from week to week. So we designed our own survey, and we're actually going to do this on a broader scale. But we started by surveying workers on Mechanical Turk. This is Amazon's online service where employees sign up, workers sign up, and they do small tasks. And one of the tasks they do is filling out ideal for research. And we surveyed 2,300 of them. We're in the process of now doing this for a national sample. And we asked the standard current population survey questions about whether people worked for pay in the last week, did they have more than one job. 60% said they only had one job. Then we asked, did you work on any gigs, hits, or other small paid jobs last week that you did not include in your responses to the previous question? And remarkably, 61% of those who said they only had one job said, oh yeah, I did these other things for pay, which is what we expected since we found these people working online. What this suggests to me is that these small tasks that they're doing, they may not be so small in the aggregate, and they actually might not even be so small compared to their total income, but it's something that they don't consider to be part of their job, and we're missing, I think, in our traditional statistics. So let me just conclude. I think that this economy is not well captured in our statistics. I think it's growing very quickly, but I think it's still small, at least when you think about Uber and the technology-enabled types of jobs like that. McKinsey estimated that it's less than 1% of the workforce. That's probably a plausible range. I think the impact of the emergence of this new form of work has a very complicated effect on existing jobs. I think it's a great oversimplification to say, well, this is just weakening employee bargaining power, causing inequality to rise and bad for workers. I think it's actually quite complicated. In some sectors where you have disruption and you had strong unions or strong employee bargaining power and rent sharing, then it's possible that we are seeing an erosion in compensation and labor standards as a result. But in other sectors where there is no bargaining power at all, then what this is doing is increasing demand for workers overall with those types of skills. I think one of the biggest problems the U.S. economy has faced over the last 3 decades is weak demand for workers with moderate level of skills, and innovation like Uber is increasing demand for drivers. Taxi drivers, by and large, are independent contractors without too many benefits. So I think it's probably lifting the job market for workers with those types of skills as a whole. And let me just conclude by saying a little bit about policy. I think our dichotomy between traditional employee and independent contractor doesn't work very well in this new sector. There are aspects of what workers are doing in the sharing economy which are like employees, and there are aspects that are like independent businesses. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. One of the problems in the way our labor laws are applied and tax laws, they're one by one. It's not an overall determination if someone's an independent contractor or an employee. It varies by statute. The statutes are not entirely clear about the weights that are given to different factors. So one recommendation I have, and I'm working on a Hamilton Project proposal on this together, is that we think about a new form of employment relationship, which we call independent workers, in between independent contractor and employee. In the spirit of Commissioner Olhauser, I'll say I think we should move at a very deliberate pace here. I think that this is still a very small segment of the economy, so I certainly don't want to rush into this, but it's something that I want to put on the table. I think we can improve the efficiency of the labor market and the fairness of the labor market if we develop a new category. And I just wanted to mention the 3 principles that I would have. One is it should be efficient. You know, right now, a company like Uber is in a position to provide some benefits to their to the workers, like accident insurance, workers' compensation insurance. Get it at a very good rate because of the pooling advantages that it has and the scale that it has. But it probably resists doing that because it doesn't want to be ruled as an employer. Well, that's not efficient. Both the workers and the company would benefit. So that's one principle. The second is, I think we want it to be neutral. I think it's great for us to have disruption, but we want the disruption to take place because the technology is better or because the business model is better, not because people have figured out ways of avoiding laws that apply to their competitors. So I think we want to make it so that companies can't free ride by rearranging their work so that their employees are independent workers to get out of paying benefits that society has decided over a very long time are fair and efficient for the operation of the labor market. And then a final aspect of this part of the economy, which I think very much applies to what Lori was describing, is it's impossible to measure hours. Someone who works for Uber can also work for Lyft at the same time. They can have the app on at the exact same time. If someone's waiting for the next ride to pop up, how would you determine how many hours they work for one employer versus another? You need to know hours in order to apply a lot of different laws. You need to know hours in order to apply the minimum wage. You need to know hours in order to apply overtime laws. And in situations where the concept of work hours for a particular employer really don't apply, then I think we don't want to apply those types of laws. So that's what I had in mind in thinking about how to create a third category of work which would make the labor market work more efficiently and more fairly over time.
Wanted to get your thoughts on this, but specifically, hoping you can broaden us. As Alan mentioned, Uber is this great example. We often use the phrase "companies like Uber" as if there are millions of those companies out there. You have this broad cross section in your role.
Yeah.
Tell us about some of the other types of workers that are in the gig economy.
Sure. I mean, a good example is Airbnb. I'm sure everyone's really familiar with it at this point. They are just owning the market share in terms of people and stuff like that when they're abroad, or even looking for like little getaways. A lot of my roommates actually use Airbnbs as like mini getaways with their girlfriends or boyfriends, which is pretty interesting. But that alone, just the concept of renting out your space. I mean, how do you, again, the hours thing? How do you work that into your hours? How does that, really work into like how you see yourself as an independent worker? because even for employees at WeWork who travel a ton, they'll put their apartment out on Airbnb and make money, basically cover their rent while they're abroad, so they'll save a ton of money. So again, how do you kind of put a definition to as that as an independent worker? But a lot of that one technology seems so straightforward, has spun off a lot of small businesses. Like in a couple of our buildings alone in DC, we have guys who actually professionally manage other Airbnb properties for other people who don't have the time or bandwidth. So I think when people look at these companies and use the word gig economy a lot, they don't understand like how deep this can go in terms of like development, other jobs, side jobs, that sort of thing. Yeah.
So, Alan, you talked about maybe 1% of the workforce today. Do you see this, though, as something that could be in 10 years and much different, or is it always going to be sort of an on-the-margin thing?
I suspect it will grow. Always going to have traditional employment. You know, companies benefit in many situations from having traditional employees. They invest in their training. There are reasons why they care about having an enduring relationship, an employment relationship. But I do think it will probably expand because the technology is developing and creating new opportunities.
Lori, the commissioner raised some concerns about regulation and how that might affect this emerging area of the economy. What are your thoughts on either the proposals that are being implemented or the ones that are being discussed?
Well, is this one working now? Okay. From a regulatory perspective, I think first and foremost, and I'm here as a member company of the Direct Selling Association, we as companies have a responsibility to give due consideration to the protection of our independent contractors who are in many ways, we look at them as customers as opposed to in my former life when Walmart or Walgreens would have been my customer. Now I'm looking at these independent consultants as our customers, and we have to be in terms of how we treat them and how we compensate them and managing the risk, and then also how they interface with consumers. Also need to be considerate of the interests of local governments, state governments, and I believe that if we are responsible in terms of taking consideration of and finding the win-win-win opportunities, then there's ideally less need for regulations that could potentially obviate the business opportunities for many of the independent workers that choose to participate in our business opportunities.
Carl, what's your take? Is the government helping, hurting, or just a neutral factor on this gig economy?
So some background as to what WeWork is. It's a collaborative communal workspace. We do everything from offering free coffee, free beer, as well as healthcare through us. I mean, it's literally turnkey solution office space. Everything's a month-to-month lease agreements as well. And we can't seem to build buildings fast enough for people that want to come in, all these independent workers. I mean, honestly, you give somebody internet power and a beautiful space, that's enough for them to run their business, which says a lot about the kind of businesses that rely on the internet, that sort of thing, those commerce platforms. But in general, the government's been really great with us. I mean, I think they look at the gig economy as a source to fuel more business growth. I've never really met a government employee who's been anti, independent workers or people getting more money or getting paid to do something. So with our growth as WeWork, it's been nothing but positivity.
And Lori, I promised we'd talk a little bit more about technology. I know, big companies that, I feel like Target knew that my wife and I were expecting twins before her mother knew we were expecting twins. And you talked about how you're empowering your employees. Can you tell us about how, even as independent consultants, are you helping them get some of this big data and some of these other things that, presumably some of your competitors at a Walmart might have at their fingertips?
So the level of interest we might have is a little bit different than, for instance, Target, who's going to watch your shopping patterns as you check out. But generally speaking, what we can get, and the way it works is through the transactional data. You can overlay it on external databases such as Experian data. There's a tool that you can use to really get a lot of texture in who your customers are. Even down to the level, for instance, we know what kind of smartphones in general our constituency would use. It allows us to really make decisions how to communicate, where to communicate, finding other things that they're interested in so that you know how to create an experience around the brand, the product, and there's where the crossovers are. And especially from a geographic and demographic profiling or mosaic, we can really help our sales organization get laser focused on who their customers really are. And I believe in doing this, and one of the things we've started to see is, and Euromonitor is helping us identify this, that we've actually seen the category for premium skincare grow because we're able to target the would-be consumers who perhaps haven't been involved in the category yet.
All right, well, I have a bunch more questions, but I don't want to leave the audience out. So if there's any questions from the audience, just raise your hand. We can get a microphone to you.
I have one. Joe Mariano with the Direct Selling Association. Thank you. Alan, I have to ask you, this idea of the third category of independent worker is fascinating. A suggestion that I'd like your reaction to. Very, very challenging, for one of the reasons being the statistic that you cited. When you talk to people, they didn't think of these other activities as employment or even a business activity. It was sort of just something they were doing on the side. And that's perhaps why you had the answer that you had, where so many people said they were only working one job. And Carl, I would suggest that this might be particularly true with the younger demographic who are engaged in these activities but don't think of them perhaps even as entrepreneurial. They think of them as just social activities. How does that work in this whole thing?
It's a very good question, and I'll just put up this first chart because I think there are some of both things going on. One is many of the people who are doing this on the side and have another full-time employment relationship don't think of it as work, and they don't report it as such. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who are doing it full-time who are not reporting themselves as self-employed. They're reporting themselves as employed. And that's why you see with the IRS data so many more people who are filing Schedule C than are showing up as self-employed in the current population survey. So I think it's a mixture, and I think there are a lot of workers who think of what they're doing as being closer to an employment relationship than to being an independent business. And when they respond in the surveys, that's showing up as undercounting the self-employed.
I think it's also a perception thing too. I think the words job, employed are very charged, loaded words for people my age, I guess. I don't know. Because none of my friends have literally stores on Etsy, and they don't consider that a job. It's merely a passion, something they're doing on the side, and they never know to report it on taxes or anything. So it's a lot of generate. But it's one of those things where I think it's definitely maybe a generational thing, but the way I guess my fellow millennials, the way they conceive and perceive of work, it's becoming more of a passion, something they love to do, rather than I do this for X amount of money so I can save it away for 401k, that sort of thing. They're just doing what they love and kind of letting the chips fall where they may, I guess. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I'm Doug Holtzaken. Questions for the panel. About a week and a half ago or so, the Department of Labor put out new interpretive guidance on the employee-employer relationship and who really is an independent contractor. And so sort of question one is, was this a good idea? And then question two, did it cause anyone you work with, any of the companies, to sort of rethink what they're doing? And is it going to freeze the nature of these relationships in the near term?
We actually are dealing with that more on an internal basis for the kind of casual services that we need for conducting the business on a number of levels, whether it's a high intensity short-term program that we want to bring in people for, a casual labor for different things, and it's that's where we've had to really put a lot of consideration and guidelines, and using more agencies rather than bringing in contractors for work. And we're very cognizant of that, especially being in California, that we can't treat contractors as casually as we could have in the past, and pretty much leverage agencies where they're employed for those agencies, or have to set up an employment relationship for them through those agencies. We've seen that having more of an impact than the relationship with the independent sales organization.
I would just say, Doug, I think more clarity is a good thing. Right now, there's a lot of ambiguity about who is classified as an independent contractor and who's classified as an employee. But one of the difficulties is that the definition varies by statute. And what's used for the IRS is different than what's used for the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the IRS, for example, has 20 points to consider without weights given to the points. So even though it may seem clear because of these points, it's still ambiguous.
Yeah, I mean, for the smaller companies that use independent contractors like Xerx, which is a really cool business, I know people have heard of them. They're basically on demand. It's almost like an Uber model, but you drop a pin, you drive your car into the city. There's a valet that takes your car, and for whatever amount of hours you need, they park the car somewhere, look after it, and they come back with your car. They have relatively small workforce, so there's not. Yeah, right.
Did you give Doug the email address?
Yeah, DC. Oh, they're making a killing in DC. This place is incredible. But they have a relatively small workforce compared to Uber. What's going on in California with Uber, which is huge. I mean, a lot of their margins depended on their definition of their independent contractors, whatever you want to call them. So, I mean, I guess the smaller companies are finding it a lot easier to kind of pivot and be like, okay, new definition of employee, we can kind of roll with it. Whereas the bigger guys who've put a lot of stake, a lot of financial backing into that specific model and those specific margins, they're having a much tougher time.
Anyone else from the audience? Got one back here?
Yes, the guy farthest from the microphone.
Yeah, I'll have to throw it to you.
Thanks. Rob Pegarero, Yahoo Tech. I was wondering if any of your findings, it's now been a few years since we've had changes in the health insurance market, has this helped the gig economy, hindered it, made no difference? Like I know, Carl, you mentioned you provide health insurance on your own to your clients. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Is that me or?
I mean, have you seen any effect on this with the folks that you work with?
Yeah, people love it. I mean, we just partnered, so TriNet is one of our partners that they put healthcare. We offer healthcare discount through TriNet, as well as Chase, which does discounted payment technology for people who do high transaction rates or stuff like that. It's big, especially for small companies that have literally just started. They're very nascent in their stages of growth. They don't really know where to go. I think having a structure like that really helps them. And the big thing about WeWork too is that it's such a big community. We have about at least 30,000 plus members globally. And we're talking about companies from Red Bull to a guy who just had an idea and just got an office space. And the fact that it's so turnkey, so easy to kind of revolve through the door, that everyone loves working with each other. These buildings are packed floor to ceiling with like different companies, every industry. Our Chinatown location, which is about a couple miles away from here, has everything from Gilt City, which does fashion, to literally a magician named Max Major who needs a place to balance his books and do everything like that. And he's got a great office, but people love working with him. But all the industries that rub together, it feels like it creates a lot more collaborative experiences and really room to really share knowledge, because things like navigating DC tax laws and things like that, a company that's been around for 5 years who moves into WeWork can help out a company who's like their first year navigating those kind of laws. So for offering those basic services and things like that through us, we do streamline a lot of things, but I find that a lot of the help these companies get are usually from each other and from other businesses.
Lori, what about you? Is the Obamacare helping your independent workforce? And you also have a direct workforce too, right?
So for the independent workforce, it probably hasn't had that much of an impact. And that's really the result of who our workforce is. For the most part, they're women, generally in their late 20s to mid 40s, and they're often looking for an alternative career because they've made a decision to have a family and want to work inside the home as opposed to outside the home, which means there's generally another income going on and that there's benefits associated with that otherwise. There are also people who tend to be educated and have had careers, so they're very cognizant of what their opportunities are and they take advantage of it. So we really haven't seen much of an impact internally. It's actually been a positive thing. And again, the California exchange has been perceived as being very beneficial in terms of choice for our employees and giving them an opportunity to perhaps procure a provider that they wouldn't have been able to get from our benefit carriers. That gives them a little bit more flexibility. So a couple of them have tapped it for that perspective. But I would say overall, it hasn't had a major the sales organization.
Mm-hmm. And Alan, to pick up a little bit what Carl was saying about, not sure if they need to file taxes and other things like that. Our Social Security system, our healthcare system, a lot of that's based around the traditional definitions of employment. Is this gig economy takes off? Does that put any of these structures which already have some fault lines in them at more risk?
It probably does. I mean, if you look at studies of the tax gap, the segment of the economy that tends to underreport its income and pay below the tax amounts that it's supposed to tend to be more independent businesses, more small businesses. Some of it will be inescapable in that there will be a paper trail, unlike a contractor who gets paid in cash if it's done online. I think that can help with tax enforcement. I think the law is pretty clear that independent contractors contribute to Social Security because they're self-employed workers and they pay both halves, which if they were an employee, otherwise the same, the employer would pay roughly 6.5% of their contribution. So I don't think there's any ambiguity there in terms of the law. I'm just concerned about the potential for underreporting. And that's one area with independent worker status. You can imagine the intermediary, which is helping to match the independent worker with the customers, providing tax advice, doing some withholding the way traditional employers do it. That can make the administration of our tax system work better.
Great. Any other audience questions? One more?
Being at Princeton, you're
I think they're bringing you the mic. I'm sorry. Thank you.
at Princeton, you're closer to the New York City than we are. So I was hoping you could sort of walk me through the workings of the New York City taxi market and make sure I sort of understand how it was working. The city would auction off medallions, right? And presumably from an economic perspective, the city was capturing the rents that the taxi market represented. So am I correct? Is what's happening here is as Uber enters in, presumably the rents are going to the consumers at the expense of basically New York City taxpayers are going to have to raise equivalent funds because the rents will no longer be collected from the selling medallions. Do I understand sort of how this has worked and what Uber effectively represents in terms of the economics of the taxi market?
Well, Princeton's not as close to New York as you might think. And just looking nationally, the way that taxis are regulated varies from city to city. Many cities restrict the number of drivers and licensed medallions. And I think Uber has been successful for a number of reasons. One is you had an inefficient regulated taxi market, not only which limited supply, but also had other regulations which didn't make all that much sense. Closer to my home, if I take the train from New York to Princeton Junction and then take a taxi to Princeton University, that taxi's licensed in West Windsor. It's not allowed to pick up a person on Princeton University campus and take them back to the train station. Now, you can imagine that that's pretty. And I've been doing some work looking at Los Angeles, where taxi drivers have a passenger in the back seat of their car about a quarter of the time that they're working, compared to Uber drivers who have a passenger about 65% of the time. So you could see how the rates could be half as much, and the drivers could still make more money because they're being more productive more of the time that they're working. And I think this is true, by the way, of occupational licensing in general. Occupational licensing, which has grown, as the commissioner said, to about 30% of the workforce, is often used to raise fees. And it often becomes less or a combination of the employees in the profession trying to restrict entry, but being embedded by the state or local government that wants to raise fees. And I think the consumer loses out in that. But I think when you get back to Uber, the technology is also just better. The taxi dispatch system is old-fashioned. It's 50, 75 years old. And being able to use mobile technology is just an improvement. I think Uber has been extremely successful for a combination of reasons. One is that the regulated taxi industry was inefficient, and the other is, on top of that, it just has a better mousetrap.
All right. Any other questions? Well, one I wanted to pose to Alan in the paper that was distributed today, showed that this gig economy, by a couple different measures, could be growing twice as fast as overall employment from 2002 to 2014. Of course, we had a massive recession in there. I mean, Any thoughts on, is this emerging because people aren't finding the traditional employment that they desire, or is this really a more desirable choice for workers?
That's a great question. So when I started on that project with Uber, I thought what we would find was that many of the drivers had been unemployed and they started driving for Uber out of desperation. And in fact, it looked like the opposite. Only 8% came from unemployment before they started driving for Uber, which surprised me that it was so low. And then secondly, when you look at that exponential growth chart, it's taken off when the unemployment rate fell below 6%. I don't think the constraint, look at how it gets steeper as the unemployment rate came down. So I think it's providing an option that a lot of potential drivers are finding appealing.
What about you? What do you see, Laura? Your independent workers, not have other opportunities, or are they choosing to be in that area?
Well, when it comes to the economy and the recession, we've seen it work actually to our advantage in both ways. We launched the business in 2008 for the independent sales organization. And at that point in time, we of early adopters were coming out of the real estate and mortgage industries, looking for alternative income streams because the ones they were accustomed to were going away. So they were looking at it as a plan B alternative income. But ultimately, as the economy's improved and people have choice, now they're looking at it as a choice way of working and really looking more for work-lifestyle balance or opportunities where there may have not otherwise been some for him. For instance, we have a large constituency of consultants who are the spouses of military officers, where they're challenged otherwise for employment because they move around a lot, and they're able to move this business with them because of the mobile and web technology that enables it. But we're also finding, and I think it would be the case with Uber, when the economy improves, your customers improves, your consumer base, and so it becomes a more attractive business opportunity for people as well.
And Carl, I mean, you talked about, it sounds like these shared workspaces are pretty exciting, place, collaborative, free beer, lots of benefits. And now, are these types of places, though, and the folks working in the gig economy, I mean, that sounds great for a young millennial type person. Do you see these as jobs that lead to careers?
Totally. I mean, people always peg us as like nothing but 20-something-year-olds running around, drinking beer, working on laptops. Actually, I would say the age demographic, just even in DC, heavily 30s, 40s, 50s. People who have very serious businesses, because it's not really cheap to get office space with us. So you have to be very serious about your business. It's not something you do on a lark. And the fact that it's so welcoming, inviting, you can actually have clients come over. A lot of these people are pivoting from having a home office to having a permanent real office where they can actually have clients come visit instead of oddly come by their house for some meeting. So I think the way our current growth is really saying a lot about the sharing economy. I feel like it's been applied to pretty much every possible thing. Like there's a new Uber for boats. I forget what the name of it is, but you can actually rent boats now on the Potomac by a per hour basis or a half day basis. Same thing goes for cars now. You can actually if you have a really nice BMW, put it out there for someone to rent for the day. So as we see that kind of model grow and grow, and my generation kind of become accustomed. At this point, like when I go out on a vacation with my friends, we don't look at hotels, we look at Airbnbs. We always almost default to that. So as that becomes more of a reality, and people younger than us really take that to heart, I think that you're going to see companies like this continue to grow and pop up everywhere. It's just I think it's more so of a pivot of a state of mind rather than an economic thing.
Sure. And Lori, the paper that everyone got a copy of here today, showed that the gig economy is sort of supercharging business creation. For example, non-employer taxi and limo services, mirroring the growth of Uber, increased 10% over a 4-year period. What are you seeing? Is direct selling and that type of the business spurring entrepreneurs out there across America?
Well, I like to think it is, and the stories of the individuals who participate in the business, and people participate for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it's purely the social engagement or the category engagement or opportunities for training and personal development, because a lot of times, as I mentioned, it's women who are made the choice to stay home, raise a family, but still need an identity outside the home. And sometimes just starting that way, they discover a knack for their entrepreneurial talents. And so from that perspective, we see people coming from all other careers and places to find their inner entrepreneur, if you will, and have their own business. And our consultants see themselves as CEOs of their own company. They refer to themselves that way. And whether it's a very small, part-time business for them, or whether it's a full-time business where they're building organizations that work with them, and they see themselves as CEOs.
And you have, you said you were more in a traditional business model before. I mean, how does, in terms of your labor footprint, I mean, how does that look different now compared to when you working with a large retailer to sell your goods?
Well, I guess there are a lot of ways to answer that, but the way it looks different, first of all, is the difference in the business from where we started as a small boutique brand, basically, to one of the largest skincare brands in the United States, premium skincare brands right now, which has all been enabled by passionate, independent business owners, if you will, finding their opportunity to build a business around our brand. And so it's made a tremendous difference in the way the business looks and the way it works. And going from having a few people behind a glass counter and have our products effectively locked, I think of, not breaking through the glass ceiling, but breaking out of the glass counter as really being the key to the growth of the business. And we have effectively, close to 50,000 women selling our products now, and 50,000 people earning an income as a result of selling our products and helping others start their businesses as well.
Sure. Alan, you mentioned that the government stats as we have now don't always do a great job of catching this economy. I guess what advice do you have for your fellow economists here in Washington to do a better job tracking this area?
Well, there are a couple of things. One, our statistical agencies have been underfunded, and they don't have sufficient capacity to do the kind of research and make the kind of improvements that I think we need, and I think our country pays a great price for that. Very good example is something called the Contingent Worker Survey, which the Bureau of Labor Statistics conducted in 1995 and 2005 and hasn't done since then, which is one of the areas where we try to find information about workers who have irregular work. So that's one easy way to address this problem. Secondly, I think we need to rely more on administrative data. I think the government should make it easier to match the administrative data with some of the survey data. It's very difficult now for the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census Bureau to actually match their employer list. It requires an act of Congress. And I think we could have sufficient privacy protections. If you think about what businesses are doing and how they know about whether you have twins or have pimples or skincare needs that you have, and the protections that we have within government, which I think are necessary, but the private sector is way ahead of official government statistics. And then thirdly, I think we need to do more these types of issues, which is what Larry Katz and I are trying to do with the survey that I mentioned.
Sure, great. Just wanted to reach out to the audience one more time to see if any other lingering questions out there.
I've got one that follows up on Commissioner Olhausen's remark. This is to follow up on Commissioner Olhausen's remark about regulatory humility. When will be the proper time, do you think, for government to step in? There's been a lot of attention, obviously, around Uber. It's even been given great attention in the presidential campaign, the developing presidential campaign. So when might be the time for the government approach to this to change?
What's your thoughts on the policy aspect of this, Alan?
I think what Secretary Clinton said was exactly right, that this is a part of the economy that's providing lots of exciting opportunities, and it's one that's raising important questions. How we answer those questions, I think, will take some time. What I would recommend is to see a commission with representation from lots of different groups to study how this segment is changing the workforce. Are there ways of creating more in their so they lost not only their job but also their retirement savings.
And Lori, any final thoughts from you?
Well, we're not Enron. But I do think that, we're going to be, it's change, and change is inevitable. And as Commissioner Olhausen said, that said that we have, we're going to see these things happen. It's going to require modification. It's going to require some aspect of policy along the way, but to be thoughtful about it and be thinking about not harming the people we're trying to help as we're implementing various programs, whether it's by the companies or whether it's by the policymakers.
Great. And Doug?
Thank you, Eric,
Sure.
for a great job moderating.
Thank
Please
you.
join me in thanking the panel.